everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Recap with Rep. Jess. I am super excited for our two guests who are joining us today for a discussion of the ways in which the environmental movement and the organized labor movement can work together to ensure that we both protect our environment and fight for those family-sustaining jobs that so many in our community rely on. So today we're going to be primarily focusing on what's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and we'll get into lots of details about what exactly that is and what it means, and I'll give us a brief overview here in a second as well. But we'll be delving into some of the broader themes about the ways in which environmentalists and labor leaders can work together in this moment, and talk a little bit more about industry broadly. Too. So let's get into what the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, as it is so often called for short, actually is. And I'm going to pull up a couple graphics here. So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is regional because it involves a whole bunch of states working together to try to control emissions. And we'll get to that in a second. But you can see here the different states that are involved: Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. And you can see a hole in the middle there where Pennsylvania is. And Pennsylvania is potentially in the process of joining RGGI here, which is something that our governor is considering doing. And this has been the subject of heated debate between people who are for and against RGGI for a variety of reasons. And let's talk a little bit about how it works as well. And I do want to thank the NRDC for these incredible explanatory graphics. So how RGGI works is that the government sets a declining limit on carbon pollution from power plants and then puts a price on that carbon so that companies have to pay for that carbon pollution. And then the government creates a program where they invest that money that's gained back into the economy. And there's a bunch of ways that that can happen, whether direct investments into communities or investments into job creation, or educational programming. And all of that is specific state by state in terms of how the money is specifically used. And the governor's staff has talked about making sure that there's programs for workers and for jobs, and has talked about investments into what they call environmental justice communities, or EJ communities, which are communities that have concentrated pollution and more often tend to be Black and brown communities and poorer communities. But there's still a lot up in the air in terms of exactly how that'll work. And I'm excited to get into that with both of our guests today, who I'm going to bring on screen now. So we have Katie Blume from Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania, and we have Kris Anderson from IBEW. And I am so thankful that both of you were willing to join me this morning for this incredibly timely and important conversation. We know that there's the possibility that RGGI might be implemented soon and may in some form come before our state legislature. So I'm just thrilled to have this conversation with both of you. So I'll have you introduce yourselves here. Katie, will you go ahead and go first?
Sure. I'm Katie Blume. I am the political director at Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania. Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania is well known sort of as the statewide political voice for the environment. And our role is really to elect and hold accountable pro-environment legislators. We also issue our scorecard every other year because we have 2-year session cycles. We also do things like marcellusmoney.org, where we track the financial influence of the fossil fuel industry on legislators in Pennsylvania. And we look at all levels of government, trying to get some solid environmental legislation passed. In my capacity, even though we are the statewide political voice for the environment, I also handle our legislative work. So I'm meeting with legislators, discussing policy and things like that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. And then we also have Kris Anderson from IBEW. Kris?
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Representative Benham, for hosting us today. My name is Kris Anderson, and I work as a representative for the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. In Pennsylvania, we have about 40,000 members throughout various sectors. We also have about 2,500 members that work directly in coal power plants. As we see it, RGGI would target those workers And we feel that it's an unfair target as well, because we've seen in the 11 other states that have been enrolled in RGGI, almost immediately coal plants shutter and members are put out of work. I know in 2009, Pennsylvania went through the process of enrolling in RGGI with the Governor Rendell administration. And, he felt at the time that it would be economically hurtful to the state. And, in Pennsylvania, we have a larger than average unemployment rate. And where these plants reside, the number is often even higher. Displacing those workers in the ancillary industries would be devastating to already economically harmed areas. And far too often, we see the 2,500 workers that work within the plants that would be impacted. But there's also ancillary industries in mining, trucking, and manufacturing that would be devastated as well. Excuse me. Throughout the process, the DEP's 3 advisory committees have failed to endorse RGGI because of the economic impacts and the lack of focus that's being placed on those. And we don't take this approach as science deniers. The IBEW is part of the Union Jobs for Environmental Protection on a national level. And we support a federal approach to curbing CO2 emissions because we feel that would level the playing field amongst the various states. And we feel that that's the fairest approach to it, because in Pennsylvania, when we have coal plants shutter, far too often we have members relocate to different states seeking work. These are economic hubs for the areas in which they reside, and they're very important. And I feel that a public-private partnership is the best approach to ensuring that we have a healthy environment to work in. So thank you again.
Oh, thank you. One of the things that I focused on in my campaign and that I campaigned on, and some people said was unrealistic, was having these conversations between labor leaders and environmental leaders to see where we disagree, where we can work together, and what our common understanding and values are. So I'm so grateful for both of you helping to bring that promise to fruition. And for those of you who are watching, I want to draw attention to the comments section, because with the program that we're using to stream, I can do this. I can bring your comment up on the screen. So if you have a question for our panelists, please be sure to drop it in the comment section. And thank you, Joe, for tuning in and for thanking us for this video. So if you have questions or comments, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And I want to start, Kris, you talked a lot about the impact that this would have on workers. And that is a really incredible and crucial part of this conversation that we have to have. But I want to switch gears for a moment and set that aside and talk about what this could mean for the environment, particularly in Pennsylvania in terms of joining RGGI. So Kris, I'm going to actually ask you to go first on that, to kind of continue your thoughts and talk about what this might mean for the environment and the differences potentially between doing this on federal level versus through this regional partnership.
Sure. So in 2005, the Clean Air Act was imposed and required coal plants to install scrubbers that would limit harmful emissions into the environment. Since that time, Pennsylvania has actually reduced its carbon footprint from power plants by roughly 40%. They did that under a lot of belt tightening and a lot of heartache through job loss and economic investment into the plants. We saw several coal plants in Western PA shutter since then because they were just inefficient and they couldn't meet the standards. And we understand that, and we're certainly not supporting any type of harmful emissions to the environment. We understand. I mean, far too often it's our members that live in these communities. So we want their quality of life to be well, both environmentally and economically. And we feel that we don't have to sacrifice one for the other. So that's why we support any measure that would improve quality of life while maintaining the gainful employment that these folks have in the communities.
Oh, thank you. Katie, you can go ahead and answer the same question.
Yeah, so the joining RGGI, even though we have reduced emissions, we've seen that across the country as markets themselves, you have Tesla producing electric cars, right? So what we have seen and anticipate in joining RGGI is about another 25% reduction of current levels of CO2 emissions. That is the equivalent of about 4 million cars being taken off the road. And when we think about where there is bad air quality in this state, both transportation and energy generation are at the top of the list about why Pennsylvania is the 5th largest emitter of carbon emissions. And this harms not only communities of color, but also communities where workers live and all of us. Allegheny County, Bucks County, Cumberland and Dauphin County, we see high levels of emissions there. And as we've seen with the COVID pandemic, we already know that people who already experience and live with poor air quality on a daily basis, who have pre-existing conditions like asthma because of that poor air quality, have even been further impacted now because of the pandemic and things that brings. But we also look at it more holistically, not just air quality. We look at all sources of fossil fuel generation. There are a lot of coal plants that have been pushed out because of natural gas. We see some of the natural gas production, particularly in the fracking sector in Pennsylvania. There have been geologists who say, our landscape's like Swiss cheese right now, and we're seeing things impacting our water supplies as well, with latent radioactive chemicals going there. And what we are not seeing is any state regulations to really protect and uphold that environmental amendment part of our state constitution. And we're not seeing these regulations coming out of a very hyper partisan General Assembly right now. We can have economic development. We are not opposed to economic development. We're not opposed to protecting workers, but we want to make sure that the communities and the workers and the environment are all protected together. And it's more of a holistic approach, not just air quality. Obviously, RGGI will have that direct impact on air quality and direct CO2 emissions.
Oh, thank you. We got a nice comment from Juan here as well. Thank you for tuning in. And I agree, more people should do this kind of transparent work. And just as a reminder, of course, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to drop those in the chat and we can have our wonderful panelists answer them. But next, I want to talk a bit, and Kris, you already mentioned this, but the potential impact that RGGI could have on jobs. And I know there's some discussion that RGGI might create jobs in clean energy, but that it might also cause job loss in other sectors. So Katie, I want to start with you on this one since Kris already talked about it a little bit, but Kris, we'll come back to you and let you expound as well.
Yes, I have so much to say about it. I have done a lot of personal learning about things. For instance, when we look at major construction projects, there's things called multi-employer pensions, which are very important to trades labor. But one of the big concerns about job loss is, what do these people do? You can make a substantial amount of money as a worker in fossil fuel industries, in energy generation. And a lot of the solar industry, for example, right now is much more, say, residential solar panels, right? And that is substantially less income comparatively. So what can we as the environmental community do to help support things? And Representative, you had mentioned earlier some of the governor's ideas. The more broad environmental community in Pennsylvania has brought up some suggestions that we have shared with the administration and DEP. And there's an investment framework that we have been working with where we utilize some of those proceeds. And I know we'll talk about proceeds later. What do we do to help workers and communities? What do we do just for abatement issues, energy efficiency? And also, where can we find new and green energy related industrial and commercial opportunities? But what has really happened is, and we're seeing a change, we've been seeing a shift the last couple of years, particularly within the environmental community. Yes, we want to protect the environment, we want to protect people's health and safety, but we also have to think about workers, because we do need that economy to also keep pushing forward other pro-environment ideas that are out there. And we talk about things like carbon capture a lot. And you'll see the new federal administration is talking about carbon capture. Carbon capture right now is incredibly expensive. We would need that federal investment. But if we do this, and if the government, whether it's federal or state, engages on policies, not just carbon capture, but RGGI and all of these things, it can also spur further research and development that could make it more economical to install X technology to provide more jobs. And the other thing that I think the environmental community can do is also stand with our brothers and sisters in labor more frequently and understand the struggles that they're going through. We can do a lot more listening. Like I said, I've been learning a lot about multi-employer pensions. I am now going to be an expert on that. But the other thing is, and we've seen it with mine workers, we've seen it with steel workers, and there's a few other trades out there who have been diversifying where they are organizing as well. And I would love to see more diversification. How can we support that? There's a lot of folks in green industry and technology that are not unionized right now. Where do we support that unionization? Because that does increase family sustaining job wages. How do we support our friends in labor on that side? There's other areas, not necessarily RGGI specific, but where we can end up using proceeds, and we'll touch on it later, to build out other environmental programs. I'm on here with someone from the electrical workers, so I'll say, what are we doing about electric vehicle infrastructure, for example? Can we utilize proceeds to build out infrastructure projects that may take some union members out of one field, but can we use these proceeds to retain and build other infrastructure? And you're seeing that in some of the governor's energy community transition fund. You're seeing that in some of the federal administration work that is being put out there. Is how do we effectively, proactively, justly help folks actually have a real transition to some equivalent jobs. And I think it's going to be incumbent on the environmental community to support that. And on the other hand, and I'm going to put Kris on the spot, I think it's going to be incumbent on the trade community to also help educate their members, because the markets are still changing. We're seeing that globally. We can't control the markets. So what do we do to support each other and to educate each other as well going forward, so that we don't have people leaving the state for other jobs? So if the state is willing to put up funds for retraining and things like that in these green industries, let's do it. We could be the nation's leading manufacturer of more efficient solar panels in the next 5 years if we're willing to put in the investment. And those manufacturing jobs could be unionized.
Yeah, and I think we're gonna talk in a second about what those jobs could be, because I think, in many ways there are jobs that can be done that almost don't even require retraining, just a new context in which the skill is performed. So I'll look forward where that's a question that's coming up here. And I'll also add, as in a former life, as an academic worker who organized through the steelworkers, attempted to, union busting, good times. I absolutely agree with needing to organize in other areas as well. But Kris, I want to give you the opportunity to expound a little bit about the impact that RGGI could have on workers, because we do know, I think all of us on this panel admit that jobs in some industries would be lost. And so I want to hear you talk about that.
Well, so like I said before, the IBEW represents roughly 2,500 members in the power generation sector from coal in Pennsylvania. And, far too often, a lot of times we'll say, hey, we'll get a person a job installing solar panels or windmills. Unfortunately, the IBEW already represents folks that do that work, and they do that work very efficiently. And a lot of times those are more often than not gig economy jobs, because they last about 3 months. And if you have ever driven by a solar field or a windmill, there's not a parking lot outside because there's no one working there on a daily basis. If you drive by a coal plant, you'll see upwards of 200 vehicles outside because they'll employ two to 300 people at each site. That is the major focus of the IBEW is preserving gainful employment for our members. Like I said, we don't want to do that at a cost to the environment, but we're trying to find a balance in which we can do both. And like I said, it's going to take long, difficult conversations to accomplish that, but we're here for it because we understand the importance of all those things.
Absolutely. I mean, we know that this is certainly not the first conversation like this that has happened. There have been others, but this is still part of the beginning of those conversations that we're having here in Pennsylvania. And so I'm very grateful that both of you are willing to do that. So we have a question from Joe, which was, do we know how the revenue from RGGI will be spent? And the answer to that question is no. But we are going to talk a little bit about how that money potentially should be spent. So I'm going to ask both Katie and Kris to set aside that question of whether or not we should implement RGGI. We're just going to set that aside for a second, because the reality is that the governor likely has the ability to pretty unilaterally implement RGGI. And there is some movement in the state legislature from some of my colleagues to prevent that. We're not really seeing a ton of movement around that bill. So, it's depending on what the governor does, we're likely to see RGGI. And then the question becomes, with that money, how should the state legislature, for example, spend it? And I think that's an interesting question where if we set aside that should question, we can talk about maybe areas of agreement on where revenue should be spent, which I think will hint a little bit at the question that Joe asked. So Kris, I will have you go first on this question.
Sure. So the governor's office right now projects roughly $300 million would be generated from RGGI. I believe that that's wishful thinking because if the coal plants are the main revenue source, if they cease to exist, those funds will be a lot lower. Everyone tosses around the term just transition for workers and communities. And the IBEW estimates that we would need roughly $200 million for just transition for the workers and the communities alone. I know there's a lot of talk about using it for green technology expansion, environmental justice communities being impacted as well. I believe that's spreading the money very thin, and it's trying to fill a lot of voids with a small amount of money. Obviously, and I'm a little biased, but I feel that the workers in the community should be placed first. Before we can do any green technology investment, we need to ensure that the folks that live and work in these communities can still provide for their families before we can move forward.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about, there's a few different phrases that get thrown around, I think, and the first being that there are no jobs on a dead planet, but the second being that the number one predictor of a poor health outcome is poverty. And so when we're talking about that balance between those family sustaining jobs and our environment, we are talking about public health, I think, in both instances. And as someone who very much specializes in healthcare policy, that is near and dear to my heart. So I appreciate the ways in which you weighed both of those considerations. Katie, same question.
Yeah, so there's a couple things floating out there. There's the governor's plan. There's things that we've talked about in the community, and Kris brought up some really good points. And it's not just IBEW represents a whole ton of coal workers, but there's also natural gas fired power plants. They also generate emissions. So all of the energy generation, because Pennsylvania generates a lot of energy for the Northeast. So recently, the state of Virginia just joined RGGI, and I believe their first quarter auction proceeds, when they produce less energy than we do, I believe their first quarter take was $43 million. So if you scale that up, I'm going to be optimistic and say we're looking at more than $300 million. Some people might roll their eyes at me. I'm also not an economist. I know about economics, but I do not have a PhD in economics. But some of the things that we have specifically been talking about, the governor is reasonably on board with some of these ideas as our partners have been discussing this, is kind of a greenhouse gas abatement strategy and investing in that. I had already mentioned carbon capture, which I feel is incredibly expensive right now. We can do oil and gas well plugging. We can do combined heat and power and microgrid capabilities, which would be some of these similar jobs. We also can invest in clean transportation options as well. We can look at forest stewardship. We can look at what we can do. That's like a complete job switch transition. And where do we provide financial incentives as well for clean energy businesses to locate or expand operations in Pennsylvania? Because recently, one of our partners released a fossil fuel subsidy report, $3.8 billion in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry overall, right? Well, what happens if that industry is less subsidized, right? It is exploitative. We exploit the earth, we exploit workers, we exploit communities, and these massive corporations are sitting on millions and millions of dollars, and they get extra dollars because they're subsidized. Why are we not giving the same subsidies to bring green businesses here? Why are we not subsidizing workers? Why are we subsidizing CEOs? And that is going to be a big thing as we continue to develop these plans. And the legislature will be able to, just sort of a little tricky point, the legislature will be able to appropriate part of the proceeds because the governor had to do this via executive action, because the legislature could not come together to actually do it jointly through legislative maneuvers. That some of the funds are going to be reserved. And those are programs where we can really build out things like energy efficiency. We can really build out more clean transportation options. I'm just going to keep picking on Kris a little bit. When we can talk about electrifying buses, and I'm like, yes, jobs for IBEW to build those grids, right? So we can do things like that with the investments. And then there's going to be that other bucket of funds that the legislature will be able to appropriate. And I think that's where the legislature should really come together and say, we're giving how much money to these fossil fuel companies, which are very market driven. Why are we not also subsidizing green technologies and making Pennsylvania that leader? And Kris brought up a good point. A solar installation job. I have a solar field half a mile from my house. I think it took them a month and a half to fully construct. It's not big. We have like 8 rows. But what do we do? Like, are we manufacturing the materials here needed for those solar panels? Do we switch to more of a manufacturing because those are more temporary job sites? Is that an area that we can start investing in? And I think just in terms of green jobs, I look at the Mack truck facility in the Lehigh Valley, which is producing electric garbage trucks. And New York City has a contract for that. So where do we invest in these things? And I think it's just going to take a lot more conversation. And when I think about trades husband, labor guy here who lives in my house, there's some very specialized workers. And we really need to pay attention to some of those more specialized trades as well, and not just paint everything with a broad brush as we go forward and keep talking about where we can plug people in. And, there's mining in Wyoming, there's natural gas, and the market for coal in Pennsylvania is already declining. And we're seeing these emissions more and more coming from the natural gas power plants. So let's just keep moving forward and talking about it.
I will say that Katie and I are on the same page when it comes to EV charging station, because the IBEW does support that legislation that's currently being discussed. So I look forward to working together on that.
Yeah.
That's really wonderful. I was just going to ask you for your thoughts on that. So you jumped right in there, which is perfect.
Sorry.
Please feel free. No, I mean, anytime, feel free to hop in and do that. And I'll say Local 5 is in my district, and they have 2 charging stations outside, and I have a plug-in hybrid. So I have when I have visited, I have made use of those charging stations, which is
well, and I'm glad you brought up Local 5, because our construction locals are home to some of the most impressive training centers in the world. And that's something that we're very proud of, because we use that to train our workers for tomorrow's technology. And we want to have the best and the brightest ready to do the work when needed. So we're certainly investing in our members daily, so they are able to work on these technologies as they come about.
Which is really wonderful. And I think that's been among one of my favorite things that I get to do as an elected official, is visit all of these union training sites, which is just fun. I have not yet gotten to go to the operating engineers. I'm excited to do that because I understand I'll get to drive some very large things, which is always a good time. Yeah, so what I'm excited about here is that, I think there's this agreement around how much money we're going to get from this, which, I think we'll know when it happens, right? If it happens at that point. But I'm seeing a lot of agreement on where we could direct that money. And it's to workers, and it's to impacted communities. And I think that is really exciting to me, to see that agreement and some agreement on other policy issues here too. So I think the other question that I have is to think about, we talk about retraining and education, but I know too that there are jobs that exist in the clean energy economy that use the same skills as you use in a coal plant or in a natural gas plant. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on what jobs would exist for union workers as we move forward into that clean energy economy. Because I'll just put it out there, I think regardless of what the governor does, regardless of what the state legislature does, that seems to be the way our economy is just headed more than anything else. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because one of the things that I can do is continue to support those kinds of jobs as well when they come up. So Kris, I think I'll have you go first on this one.
Sure, thank you. Like I said before, we already represent members who do a lot of the work that is being targeted. They do that work very efficiently. So there's not a demand to expand that workforce to the limits that would satisfy the job loss that would be created. And that's what really concerns us. Like I said, we have the construction trades that a lot of folks like to point to. But those construction halls are already filled with members. They don't have doors open. We're trying to compete with our non-union competitors, and the best way we can do that is on time and under budget. And so we're running very lean crews that are doing a lot of work, but they're doing that to the utmost quality. So I don't know if contractors necessarily have the appetite to expand their workforce to kind of bring these workers on. And that's what really worries me.
Yeah, that is a really good point. And, we don't know how that demand could change or not, or if it stays the same. And I can definitely understand that fear for sure, because we do know, right, that union workers do it better, that quality is higher. And I think that is so important. So when we're talking about that competition, that's a really good point. Katie.
Yeah, and I'm just going to go back to something I said earlier is, we subsidize so much of the fossil fuel industry when the markets are changing. Why are we not subsidizing these contractors who are building these more green buildings and things like that? Why are we not doing those same kinds of subsidies? If we have this much in available resources to do it for one industry, why are we not doing it for another when it's glaringly obvious that markets are changing, so that we can continue to bring in new workers? And I'm very curious. I know within the next several months, the federal administration is going to be releasing both climate and infrastructure initiatives as part of that Build Back Better plan. And I really think it's going to be interesting. I think this is the most pro-union administration. We like beyond FDR, I think. I mean, he just did a video for Amazon workers, and I think that's also going to play a role, and hopefully also drive some conversation here in Pennsylvania as well. And I think with that package, when we talk, as I said several comments ago, more holistically about all of those issues being put together, I think that's really going to have to be the path forward. And making sure that our General Assembly, we can't just give one bucket of money to one group. We also, if you want subsidies, we're going to have to give it to another group as well.
Yeah, Kris, do you have some thoughts on that? Because I feel like Katie shared a lot of things that I would be really interested to hear your thoughts on.
So we're very pleased with the approach that President Biden has taken. And, the IBEW was one of the first labor unions to endorse him. And we did that because we appreciated his approach to the energy sector, especially because of the effect that it would have on our members. He understands the importance of carbon capture technology. And recently I saw that Consol Energy is pursuing a 97% carbon neutral coal plant in Greene County. That's a project that I think would be great for that area, as well for the IBEW, because it would bring a ton of construction jobs to an area that has been devastated. And I know that Representative Pam Snyder has worked constantly for her district, and she's done great work, and she understands the importance of the coal mining industry to that area. And that can kind of boost Pennsylvania up as we go forward to say, look, we can have coal plants and we can do them clean. It doesn't have to be the dirty old coal plant where it's just polluting the rivers and the air. I think that, like I said before, these are going to be tough conversations, but we're here for those tough conversations, and we certainly wanted to have those as well.
Yeah, Katie, any thoughts on that?
Without getting into neither of us are scientists, I'm not going to get into that. I think, we still have a few coal-fired plants here in Pennsylvania. I'm incredibly worried about the market forces and not being prepared for it, which is why I'm having this conversation. We want to make sure people don't leave Pennsylvania. I love this state. I want workers to stay. But just looking at these market forces, there are pros and cons to what people usually refer to as clean coal, and how we deal with that. And I'm just going to reiterate my concern. I have no issue with carbon capture. I've had some great conversations with other friends in the trades about it. My biggest concern about that goes right back to federal or state investment in carbon capture solutions and things and technologies that make things actually a more clean coal plant or a clean natural gas plant, because a lot of the technology is not necessarily where we need it to be right now. So hopefully that investment, like I said, if we're subsidizing one bucket, why aren't we subsidizing the other bucket as these markets are changing? Because I find, slight soapbox here, I find it very disheartening that we have fossil fuel CEOs making tons and tons and tons and tons of millions of dollars, and workers' rates are staying flat. Communities are still getting polluted, and we're giving out $3.8 billion of subsidies, right? So why are we not doing this to actually help our workers? Why are we not doing it to actually help our affected communities? And so I just think the investments need to really be discussed further. And I think that those investments are really where trades unions, the environmental community, et cetera, can really start coming together to promote kind of the best of both worlds, hopefully.
That is the hope, right? As we continue to have these conversations. And I think, to talk about the ways in which big executives are making money and workers, they're making a good wage in many of these contexts, but it's still the bosses who are profiting. That is the question. But to talk a little bit more about the economy and market forces, it does seem like it's hitting the fracking industry. quite a lot lately. We've seen some bankruptcies and things like that in that industry. And we were supposed to have Kris Petrone on from Operating Engineers, but there was a conflict that came up there. And so, I think that we can still have a little bit of this conversation even without him. And I think the question becomes, what do we think this means for the future of natural gas with the way that the economy is trending in that area? And how do we make sure that those workers still have access to family sustaining jobs in the future? Kris, we'll go with you.
Sure. And, this is just my personal beliefs, but I think that the fracking craze created a gold rush where, a lot of companies wanted to keep drilling. And, that created an excess in the market, which drove demand down. So, the IBEW also has members that work on these drilling sites, wiring up the pumps and whatnot. So we have members that work in that sector as well. I think that going forward, there is going to be a demand for natural gas. To what level, I'm not sure. Far too often, organized labor is afraid to let high-paying jobs go, and that's the big fear that we have. In the energy sector, you'll see a lot higher union density in that area, a lot higher wages, and we think that there's a direct correlation because of organized labor's presence in the energy sector. So these jobs didn't become high paying overnight. I like to pride myself that organized labor played a key component in that. And that's why we've always cherished high paying jobs, because we understand, like you said before, poverty is a direct indicator on quality of life. And the further that we can get away from that, I think the better off that society as a whole will be.
Absolutely. And Katie, we'll hop to you.
Yeah, so there's I think one of my biggest concerns, aside from the fracking industry specifically, and I'll get to that in a minute, but I think natural gas overall, we see a lot of pipelines in Pennsylvania. We've also seen some recent news stories about some significant problems with that. This is all going to tie together, I promise. A lot of the natural gas that we put through the pipelines in Pennsylvania don't stay here, right? A lot of times it's shipped overseas to make plastics, and we call that the petrochemical industry. We saw last year a bill that was added to give more subsidies to the petrochemical industry. Well, two things happen there. One, why are we doing more subsidies for an industry where market forces are the ones hurting that industry, right? But also, we have science. We do not want to be the next cancer alley that we know exists in Louisiana, especially affecting communities of color there. But also, what happened when that bill passed is it was rammed through the General Assembly, and nobody was brought to the table. And one representative in particular just tried to get an amendment attached to that bill to have stronger air quality monitoring, to have better public participation in what's going on. And that failed. And it wasn't so much like we're against some industry building jobs. It's we don't have environmental protections. We see this with pipelines. We see this with fracking. We see this with petrochemical. It's not that we are against different jobs. It's the fact that our General Assembly as a whole, I don't want to pick on you, Representative Benham. I mean, you just started 3 months ago, but our General Assembly as a whole continues to refuse to add environmental protections to any of these things that are happening. Why are we not doing this? And that's my biggest question. We can't get a simple air quality monitoring piece of an amendment attached to a bill. We can't even get that through such a hyper-partisan General Assembly right now. And I think more conversations like this we just have to keep talking. We don't want high-paying jobs to go away. And we don't want any jobs to go away. Obviously, we're in a pandemic, a little bit of a different economy right now. Again, we'll see what happens with Build Back Better and the president's plan. But I think that when we look at everything broadly, we've got health concerns. Like I said earlier, our geology is a little bit like Swiss cheese right now when it comes to fracking, and we've seen numerous health study reports. We've seen radioactive materials leaching into water systems, naturally occurring radioactive materials in the ground. And some of your neighboring representatives have been doing some work on that. But we're not making it safe. We can have these industries, but we can't even make it safe. Yeah.
Right. Like, I just signed on to a letter that was about helping prevent methane leaks. And, I had a conversation with, of course, environmental organizers around it, but also with Kris from the operators to say, and his response was, this is great. This helps make it safer for workers as well. And I think so often when we're talking about environmental monitoring, it's not just for the surrounding communities. It's to make sure that the workers on those job sites are safe as well. A reminder for folks, you can put any questions or comments in the comments. If you're watching and it's been shared, I do think you have to comment on the original video for me to see it. But either way, feel free to make any comments. I do want, in the interest of time, to sort of move toward our conclusion here and just to ask each of you to share some concluding thoughts about this conversation and maybe what you're hopeful for in the future as we continue to have these conversations moving forward together. So Kris, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Representative Benham. Like I said, the advisory committees that have met to talk about RGGI have all failed to endorse it. The Independent Regulatory Review Commission has asked for a year delay in it. It's already been mentioned that going through a pandemic, any of ancillary effects that could be caused by job loss, I think should be thought long and hard about. And like I said, I'm not trying to play into fears, but we have a real concern because we've seen what happens in other states when a state enrolls in RGGI. We need to be cognizant of that. We have to understand that coal plants will close, job losses will happen, and what do we do to those affected communities? We're talking about a tax base in Indiana County, which would be wiped out completely. And like I said, Pennsylvania doesn't need a case study on what happens when a large employer closes up shop. We try to invest in these workers in these steel communities, and we trained everyone to be a coder. So instead of being an unemployed steel worker, they were an unemployed coder. We need to do a better job of attracting industry. I certainly agree with Katie. We want to manufacture the green technologies, but unfortunately, we haven't seen that get off the ground in the U.S. too often. But we're certainly happy to have those conversations, and I appreciate you having me here today.
Oh, thank you so much for being part of this, Katie.
Yeah. Just beating that dead horse about where's our investment money going to. And I do agree with Kris. I think obviously the environmental studies that have been coming out with, all of these scientists saying things are happening more quickly. Things are happening more quickly. We're going to have a much bigger global problem more quickly. And there are different opinions in the scientific community, et cetera. Representative, you mentioned it earlier, if there's no planet, there's no jobs. But I think joining RGGI is a great idea. I think we have some time, especially with the governor's proposal from the beginning of February, to really be having these conversations, to have these conversations through this year's budget cycle, to continue. Kris referenced 3 committees, I believe it was, in the course of this conversation. There's like a dozen committees between DEP, and I can start naming off their acronyms here. But I think it's incumbent, especially on those of us in the environmental community that have relationships with some of, the Environmental Quality Board, et cetera, to make sure that we get, Kris's concerns out there. Like, as we are finalizing this rulemaking process, we really want you to address this. The environmental community has sent letters and submitted comment on that. The overwhelming majority of Pennsylvanians, based on comments to DEP about RGGI, I want to say it was around 95%. I can actually email you the stat. I'm not remembering it off the top of my head. Were positive for joining RGGI. So we know we want to do it, but it's the how. It's definitely the how, and I think this conversation is a great start. I think conversations that have been happening all over the place, and really just trying to drive our representatives and senators to get to that point of listening to all of the stakeholders and not just ones here or there, not just the people who give the big campaign bucks, not just the lobbyists who take folks to the fanciest dinners, right? Really, it is incumbent on our state legislators to hear all of the perspectives out there and weigh them equally. And I think going forward, let's do this. Let's keep having these conversations. Kris mentioned, $200 million for transition. I'm going to be optimistic about those Reggie proceeds. Let's say $400 million. We'll get everything done. But we don't know until we try. We don't know until we keep talking and learning from each other.
Absolutely. And I mean, here it's clear we see some very respectful disagreement about whether or not Reggie is a positive, a net positive, or a net negative. And that's why we're going to continue to have these conversations, because it is so important to have stakeholders who represent every single impacted community. I want to make sure this, I think, was a great conversation, a great starting place between conservation voters, Katie, and between IBEW with Kris. And I want to make sure we're bringing more people to this table and start to involve more folks who live in areas that are impacted by this, those environmental justice communities that we're talking about. I think that is a really great place for us to start. So thank you both for participating in this conversation. I'm going to offer some concluding thoughts, and I will see you on the flip side. Thank you, everyone who tuned in today. We did get one comment from Beth that I don't think we as citizens ever get to see where anything is budgeted. And that is a really great comment, because one of the things that I've tried to do, and certainly that we're trying to do with this conversation, is provide that window on what the heck is going on with your state government. I don't think we talk about that enough. And that's why I try to be as transparent as possible. I think this is my third live video this week, breaking down what's happening on the state level. And I'm going to continue to do that. We don't have a finalized budget yet. We're still working on that. The Appropriations Committee, which I am not on, is still digging through that. But certainly, once we have a budget that we're going to be voting on, that I will be right here breaking that down for you. So thank you all again for tuning in today. If you did not get a chance to watch this live, no worries. It'll be up here for you to tune in at any time that you would like, because I think it is so important when we're talking about environmental policy, when we're talking about workers, that we provide every single resource possible for all of us, everyday folks in Pennsylvania, to understand what's going on. So that's today's special edition of Recap with Rep. Jess, and I will see you all next week.